Tell me truthfully, Uncle, when you look at me, do you wish you saw my father's face instead? Of course I do. I'd be a poor brother if I didn't wish that Gavilar had lived. I failed him. It was the greatest, most terrible failure of my life. Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for the Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth. Hello, everyone! Welcome to The Storming Journey. Today we are covering Chapter 18 from The Way of Kings. I am Liz, and I will be your Ardent for this episode.
I'm Adam, and I'll be today's Worldsinger.
And I'm Elle, today's Veristitalian.
So for today's World Singing, with the theme that we have for this episode, regret, I wanted to think about something that I regret every single day. I wanted to talk about the regret you feel when you stay up late the previous night, and then you're someone who wakes up early. I think this is the most universal regret in the entire universe of universes, maybe even in the Cosmere, even though Brandon doesn't give us any scenes like that, which I personally would love, like a scene of Vasher just like staying up late, drinking, and then, waking up in the morning tired and exhausted and angry. Probably, though, he does wake up early every morning, which is why he hates life and hates everything. But that's Vasher's problem. This is my world singing, not Vasher's world singing. So the regret of staying up late and waking up early is something that I experienced a lot, being in two different graduate programs at once and getting two different doctorates at once, because I have a lot of work to do. And when I was thinking about this universal regret, I was thinking about how regret usually helps to teach us something, but I never learned with this regret. So hopefully this episode makes me learn something. It won't, but I can have hope with my regret.
I have been regretting this for like the last week and a half. For some reason, I have stayed up until like 1 a.m. and I get up at 7. Don't know why I do it. Really should stop. Maybe I will also learn something from this episode, but probably not. I have today's Storm's Eye view, and there's a lot going on. So here we go. Adolin takes Yanala on a date to solve a mystery. A cut strap might be a natural tear or intentional damage. The date unromantically continues at the Vorin Temple with Kadash. Adolin voices his concerns about his father, worried he's mad. Kadash explains the hierarchy and suggests Dalinar regrets his violence. Meanwhile, Dalinar orders increased troop patrols to combat banditry nearby. He promises to win Renarin's shards to compensate for illness. In visiting Elhokar, Dalinar suggests withdrawing from the Shattered Plains. Elhokar is outraged, so Dalinar tries a different tactic instead. Returning home, a high storm demands they shelter, and visions begin.
And listening to that Storm's Eye view is kind of exhausting. This is a chapter that goes lots and lots of places. It doesn't have like a central concept, but we have some very interesting conversations going on in here. And as I was trying to pick a theme, I noticed that all of these conversations have some sort of element of regret or like wishing that things had gone differently in the past. We have Adolin, who like is in the process of ignoring his lady friend and already regrets the fact that she's going to break up with him because of this. But it doesn't change his actions in any way. And his conversation with Kadash, and where we talk about like Kadash's friendship with Dalinar and how Dalinar has changed, and we have some regrets over that as well. And Dalinar is just full of regrets for basically everything in his life, right? For losing the memories of his wife and not wanting to replace her, for being forced into politics instead of battle, the way that he treated Renarin, for not being more curious about the Parshendi's culture and understanding them better, for not preventing Gavilar's death, and for the way he treats Elhokar. So just like all the things, so much regret in here. So kind of with this theme, the way I wanted to approach the chapter is how are our characters dealing with their regrets, and is it healthy, and do we see ourselves in them? How are any of them modeling ways we would like to deal with regrets in our lives? Because I think everyone does things that they then regret later, even if it's just staying up late. So thoughts about regrets and how you see people dealing with them in this chapter.
The two that really stick out to me are Renarin's post-battle regret, when he's very like bashful or awkward afterwards about like going in, but then like having things happen during the attack, during the hunt. And then the other one is Adolin regretting his relationships. I think I personally connect to Adolin's a lot, because whenever I start relationships with someone, I'm always like, well, this is going to end in like a few weeks. This is going to end in a few months. So might as well start prepping for that. So I prepare my little bag to leave on my journey away. But so I connect to that a lot, where it's like, this just like, this is fun, this is going great, but it's just not working out. And then with Renarin, that awkwardness and that bashfulness plays a little bit into like his neurodivergence, of course, but also I just feel that a lot whenever I do something that like I really want to do, but I do it in not a great way. I always feel that form of regret, where it's not like a deep sorrow of regret where like it's going to make me change my ways, but it's more of a like, I wish I was better, I wish it was different, in order to have approached that in a more appropriate way.
I think one of the things I see actually with Renarin's moment, at least in here, is less about him regretting that he's rushing into the fight and more a regret of like dealing with his father's response. Kind of what you're saying of, I regret that I'm not the kind of person that you want me to be, or the kind of person I wish I was. That's something that I've been dealing with a lot lately, is like my health keeps me from doing the kinds of things I want to do. And so my regrets are like things that are not really in my control of, I regret that I can't do this, but there's nothing to change about that. Like I can't suddenly not have those health issues, unlike Renarin, who ended up suddenly becoming without those health issues for radiant reasons. So I really identify with Renarin in this section, because I do think he's not saying I wish I didn't fight. He's saying I wish I was a different person with different things so that I didn't have to struggle with the thing I was struggling with that my father's now mad at me about.
And I think it's really interesting that it's Renarin's experience from Dalinar's perspective that gives us a lot of that. Like it's us having to like figure out between the lines and, you know, getting Renarin from later books. But I think about like when Dalinar sees Renarin's eyes flickered downward in shame, the edges of his mouth pulling back in a grimace. Yes, he did have emotions. And it's like we're getting this like duality of regret, where it's Dalinar seeing the regret on his son and reading it in that way, even though we see it as something perhaps more complicated than that. And so it's this interesting leveling, right? Where it's like Dalinar's perspective of Renarin creates regret in both of them, which is a really fun dynamic.
And I think it's really interesting to contrast that with Adolin's regret. Like Adolin, like maybe the way he interacts with women is just the way he is, but it seems like it's more of a conscious choice, because he is aware of it and it's something he could change about himself, but he doesn't care enough to do it, right? He's like, oh, I probably will have to send her a present. I know I'm doing something bad. So knowing that means he could change his behavior and chooses not to. Whereas Renarin he's regretting that he's not the person who can fulfill that role. And so there's a difference between regrets for lack of capacity and regrets for choices we're actively choosing not to make, right? Those are very different. We should deal with those regrets in different ways. Like we have to learn to accept our limitations, our physical limitations as humans and our mental limitations and the way we are, but we shouldn't accept our bad behavior, right? We should use those regrets to motivate us to do better in the future.
One of the things that is also notable to me in this chapter is we talk a lot about Renarin as being the autistic character, but in this chapter especially, we see how it's a genetic trait. And like Dalinar as well, like Adolin has a line where he talks about Adolin's father was known to take things to extremes. And like there are other elements where Dalinar is not cognizant of the fact that he is exhibiting very many of the same traits as his son. And so I think, like, Dalinar regrets things about himself because he thinks they're, like, choices he's making instead of, like, the kind of person he is. And not to say that, like, being autistic grants you a pass on being rude, because it doesn't. But, like, Dalinar doesn't understand, like, his own neurodivergence. He doesn't understand his son's. He's just like, my son is kind of weird. And I think that, like, understanding who you are and your brain can really shape how you regret things. Like, finding out I had ADHD late in my life, in my 20s, changed how I felt about my decisions in high school and how I handled things in high school. I regretted things, but from a different perspective, and one that I think was more generous to myself, because I had limitations I didn't realize I had that I was dealing with.
I like that a lot, Elle. The idea of, like, being generous to ourselves in our regrets. I think Dalinar is a character who's very hard on himself. And maybe for good reasons, like all the things we find out in Oathbringer, like, he really hasn't been a great person. But at the point we find him at in the story, he's trying really hard to do better and to change. And so maybe, well, I don't know, like, should he be less hard on himself? I don't know. It's an interesting question. Like, when you've made those changes, then how do you deal with that regret? Because there's, as we see in Wind and Truth, right? Like, no matter how much Dalinar changes, the things that he did in the past are not gone, right? No amount of change in the future can change the things that have happened in the past, barring time travel.
We're going to get time traveling Yasta. What I find interesting, pulling on that family aspect, is the regret that Dalinar is exhibiting here of his not spending time with his sons earlier in life, because he didn't spend a lot of time with Adolin or Renarin when they were growing up. And so you see that he doesn't connect to Renarin on that way of understanding how Renarin responds to things. Like, just that line about the emotion itself is like, yeah, your son's in his, like, late teens. You should know he has emotions if, like, you were a decent father, which Dalinar, of course, we know wasn't really that present, at least, right? And then, like, his understanding of Adolin as well, like, he doesn't understand Adolin's, like, party vibe or whatever, his latent bisexual date everyone vibes, right? And it's a regret that comes out in him trying to fix some things in some way. And it's also what I find really fascinating in this chapter is that they're a functional family. They're just not a close family. And I think Dalinar regrets that a little bit, right? They're a family that functions because of their royal aspect, right? They have to be a house that's functioning because they have to, you know, they have a lot of lives that are on their backs. They have a lot of things that have to happen. And so, like, they function, but I don't see them as close as they're, like, discreet things about each other because of not, like, growing up together, not, like, spending that time together. And so I think that comes out in, if we're reading this, because we're reading this through the idea of regret, in that those feelings and those emotions between them.
I think another area we see about regret with Adolin is his approach to religion. And Kadash is like, hey, you haven't come by and seen me about your calling and glory lately. Like, why haven't you made any progress on your calling of being a duel? And Adolin, he regrets it, but also in a level of, like, but what am I supposed to do about it? Like, my father, I'm caught between my religious responsibilities and my father's responsibilities. And, like, my father is here now. The Almighty is a concept and not here now. So what do I do? And I think that's another aspect of regret, of, like, being caught between choices. Like, both of them are probably good choices, but you do have to pick. They are opposing choices here.
You mean FOMO is regret? Is that what we're saying? Is that whenever someone feels FOMO, they're really just regretting?
I thought that was inherent in the phrase, but yes.
I think it also says something about the contrast between Dalinar and Adolin in this chapter, right? Adolin's regrets about, not being able to accept duels and about his dating life, the way he reacts to them is very passive and like, oh, there's nothing I can do about this. Whereas the regrets we see Dalinar having in this chapter, he acts on them, right? He's like, man, I should have been better for Renarin. I should have been there for him and like helped him to train for battle, even though he has these problems. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to go get some shard plate for him. I'm going to promise him that. I'm going to start acting on that. I regret our war strategy and like the way this war has gone and like the situation we're in. So I'm going to propose some changes to the king. Like Dalinar is actively trying to remedy the things that he's regretting, whereas Adolin is just like, well, there's nothing I can do about it, so I guess this is my life.
I wonder if that's like a highlight of age and a difference of like experience. Because like how I regret in my 30s is very different than how I regretted in my 20s. And how I respond to that regret is especially very different. I think about like childhood regret when you like hide it because you're so like worried about the consequences. Whereas now it's just like, okay, something happened. Let's like deal with it. Who cares? Like, let's just keep moving on. Which is also interesting when I think about like teaching and having to deal with students that are, 10, 20 years younger, 10 years for me. We're not there yet, but very younger, and they're at a different like developmental phase, right? And so I think something enlightening about regret from this chapter is the difference of Dalinar's experience and age versus Adolin and Renarin's experience and age, and how they exhibit the regret and how they respond to that.
Yeah, and we see Adolin grow into his agency over the course of the series, right? In Oathbringer, he's realizing, hey, like, I don't have to be my father. I can take good lessons from him, but give them my own twist. And by the time we get to Wind and Truth, we're seeing him actively make decisions that Dalinar wouldn't like, and that he's decided this is the way I want to live my life, and I'm not going to regret things anymore. I'm going to actively shape my own life.
I think another spot with the way that Kadash and the way that Dalinar are responding to the regret about the war, Kadash's response to regret was to leave the army and join the Ardentia, and to say, I am going to put that away. I'm going to basically try to atone by doing something that is the opposite of what I was doing. And Dalinar's reaction was to forget, to have these memories of these horrible things that he did taken away from him so that he didn't have to continually regret in the same way, that it wasn't
Incapacitating.
Incapacitate. I could not prefix for that. It would incapacitate him. Because it was, like, he could not, we find out in Oathbringer, like, he was not doing anything. Like, he was drinking himself into oblivion so that he didn't have to deal with his regret. And, like, maybe that's a degree of, like, Kadash kind of helped, but did not, like, do the things himself, whereas Dalinar was actively making these decisions and in charge. Like, that's the level of degree, but I just think that their contrast between how they handled the war and the regrets about the war is really interesting.
And building on that, the fact that they can't get away from the war and those regrets. Kadash is still training people to fight because that's all he knows how to do. Dalinar is still fighting like almost every day, right? And being the Blackthorn in many ways. And I think that speaks to like a larger regret around like a regret of fighting, right? Because when we engage in war, when we engage in fighting, we are attacking other living beings. And I think that holds on to us longer and, attaches to our soul in some way and like exists for, and affects us for a longer time. And I think that comes out in Dalinar and Kadash's regret across the series in this chapter, and also like how they approach their different things as they're growing throughout the books. I had a question. Do we think Dalinar regrets his relationship with Sadeas? Or do you think there's a regret there? There might be like later on, but I'm like curious about that relationship and thinking about regret. I don't think it comes up too much in this chapter, right? But it's hinted at throughout the rest of the books, right? And then I was curious thinking about regret specifically. that was just a question that I had going through that chapter. Does Dalinar regret that longer term relationship with him?
You mean like having the relationship, not that it necessarily like went bad, but just that like
Yeah, so he's kept this relationship with this guy for so long, right? He's not a good guy. He's a very sleazy guy, and Dalinar can very tell that, right? And so it's like, does he regret it while he's in it? Does he regret not like stopping Sadeas earlier? Or does he have a form of regret to that? And like, of course, he regrets it a little bit later on, but then he's forgiving in some ways, right? Even though he still remembers at the end of Way of Kings and Into Words of Radiance. But at the same time, I'm just curious, like before that, does he regret that long-term relationship, that long-term commitment that he's made with Sadeas about Elhokar and about the kingdom itself?
I don't think at this point he does. We get a mention of Sadeas in this chapter when Elhokar rejects his idea of High Prince of War and says, "First, prove to me you can still do battle." And Dalinar's considering, oh, we should do joint plateau assaults. Who should I approach first? Sadeas? No, not a good idea. And then he says he'd have to approach Sadeas eventually. He didn't relish the thought. Things were always so much easier when the two of them could work at a safe distance from each other. So it seems like he's basically come to accept that, like, Sadeas and I are never going to get along. Like, we see things very differently. We're pursuing the same goal, and so we manage the relationship by trying to avoid each other's circles and just like coordinating in a very like functional relationship, but not any kind of friendship like they seem to have had when Gavilar was around.
But I think in that there's a regret, right? You regret what it could have been. And so there's a level of regret where it's like when you're working with someone in that way, you're regretting that, oh, it could have been better if we had been friends for this long, right? I think there's like that aspect of regret that doesn't quite come out in this chapter, right? But I think there's a layer there, right? It was that latter part of the chapter that brought up that question. But I think there's this aspect of like, he doesn't regret the relationship, but maybe he regrets what it could have been. And so it's like regretting on the level of, something that could have been, which I forget what the grammatical term for that is. It's like the subjunctive, is that it?
I couldn't tell you.
Else. I need help.
I don't do grammar. I didn't get an editing degree. It was just linguistics.
I think it's a subjunctive, but it's also late and it's a Saturday night. So I'm going to leave it as the regret of something that could have been.
I think that it's kind of like a friendship that you regret. Like, not that you regret not having the friendship, but just like that your relationship isn't what maybe you thought it was going to be at the beginning of it. I've had a lot of friendships where like we were close and we had anticipated continuing to be close, and then we've kind of just like drifted apart. And I think there's a little bit more intentionality with Sadeas's reactions and Dalinar's, and a little more tension there. But like in general, like the regret is like sometimes I do regret it because I would have liked to continue to be friends with them, and then sometimes I'm like, am I feeling regret about this because I could have done more to reach out and made a connection and I didn't? Or do I regret the fact that I wasn't as close as I wanted to be to them? But I think like the core thing about regret is that you either you regret your intention behind doing something, you regret the thing you did, or you regret the outcome of it. So like the same event could have different ways of having regret about it. Like it could have been a positive event or a good thing you did. You intended good things, but it backfired. And so you regret the way it turned out. And so I think with Dalinar and Sadeas, the outcome of Dalinar's decisions and how Sadeas reacts is what Dalinar is regretting. He's not regretting how he's acted towards Sadeas. He's not regretting his intentions towards Sadeas. He's regretting the outcome of those actions.
Yeah, I've definitely had more and more relationships like this as I get older, that it's like, I wish that I could have been closer to you, but because of the way you react to me, that's just not possible. And so our relationship has to stay at this level. because I know like it's just not going to work out taking it to a closer level. So we're just going to stay here. And like, I'm satisfied with that. I'm sad that we can't be closer a little bit. I have a little bit of regret for that, but it's not a regret that motivates change. It's one that's like accepting of the way things are because of the nature of this person who you have a relationship with. And you just decide this is the level we're going to be at, and I'm going to accept that and be able to enjoy what the relationship is for what it is rather than wishing it was something else.
We also talk about the Dalinar and Elhokar and Gavilar moment when I was like, do you think I am an okay king? And Dalinar's like, you're a fine king. But there's like so much regret in there of like that what could have been. Like, I wish Gavilar could have lived, and that would have been nice, and you wouldn't have had to have all these responsibilities. And I regret that you, as this little boy, had to like step into, big shoulders. Or at least little boy in comparison to Dalinar. I think, how old was Elhokar when he became king?
Time for Coppermind moment.
20-somethings.
Bless the Coppermind. Anyway, Elle's looking that up because Elle's our Coppermind person. But I just think like that's also a really generative spot for regret.
He was 20 when his father was killed.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, because he didn't have a regent, right? So he's old enough to be an adult. But I wouldn't want to rule a country at 20. I was not very smart at 20. I thought I was, but I was not very smart at 20.
I wish I ruled a country at 20, because then the world would be under my palm. Nicely, democratically, maybe totalitarianly, but like not present totalitarian.
But you wouldn't murder anyone to advance your own plot.
I plead the fifth.
But it is interesting to see this relationship between Dalinar and Elhokar is always mediated by Gavilar and the comparison that Elhokar feels to his father, who we later learned maybe wasn't so great. Which is really interesting reading this chapter after having read the prologue of Wind and Truth, right? Like, oh, Gavilar was so good and so noble, and he wanted people to follow the codes, and look how we can get the High Princes to work together. And it's like, but did he, Dalinar? Like, or are we just like seeing it through rose-colored glasses? Because there's some indication that Elhokar doesn't remember it exactly the same way. That he remembers his father acting erratically towards the end. And because we only know what we know in Way of Kings, we think, oh, that means he was following the codes, and that's erratic for Alethi culture, right? But is that what it means? Still not clear. We need more information, Sanderson, please. I really want to know about Jasnah and Elhokar's childhood. Like, it's a mess, and it's important, and we need to know.
I think like the one reflection would be a comparison to Adolin and Renarin's, right? Because they also grew up as they were at war. And so you're growing up with your parent having to leave for their job every day, having to be on the job every day, not be able to be home and things like that. And I think about the later scenes that we get when Adolin and Renarin are the front by Evie. I think like that, we can reflect that, or we can extrapolate from that on to Elhokar, right? Where most likely Gavilar was an absent father, even though Dalinar sees him as like the cool big bro. Wait, is Dalinar older or younger than Gavilar? He's younger, right?
He's younger because he makes the remark in this chapter that he should be more empathetic with Renarin because he also knows what it's like to be the younger son.
Okay, so like, I just think like these dynamics are really interesting in how they play out because Sanderson doesn't lean into them in the writing, and it takes this conversation to like pull them out, right? And thinking how Adolin and Renarin map onto Elhokar in many different ways. With although they haven't lost a father, they also were raised by a father who was off at war, who was off conquering, who was not the stay-at-home father to take care of his kids type of thing. And also like thinking about the mothers too, right? Navani is someone who I think would be somewhat of a good mother, but also somewhat of a like, I'm in my own world type of mother type of thing, compared to Evie, who's like, my children are my world type of mother.
Someday we will find out in the back 5, probably book 10, which is so mean. So one other regret we see in this chapter and kind of the lore dump that we get is about the hierarchy from Kadesh, right? He tells Adolin gives him a history lesson on how the church used to be, the Vorin church, and how the church had lots of power and told people what to believe and kept people from knowing what was going on in their religion, and how different it is now. And it's interesting that Kadesh kind of regrets that, in that he can't really give straight spiritual advice to Dalinar because of the way things are structured now. Dalinar's now his spiritual superior, because he owns the Ardents. And so he can't speak truth to power, as it were, and say, hey, like, seeing the future is a bad thing. Seeing the past is kind of suspect as well. So maybe you should be cautious about this. Like, Dalinar has no spiritual advisor because of the history of how this religion is set up.
I think the part of it that was most interesting to me about that section was the line about how the priest claimed that common men could not understand religion or the Almighty. Where there should have been openness, there was smoke and whispers. And that reminds me a lot of some of the ways and some of the times that I was taught in the LDS Church about how religion changed in the years following Christ's death. And the reason why there isn't this need for a restoration in the early 1800s of bringing it back, because the priests were in charge. It was the priests who would read the books in Latin instead of in English. And one of the things that's really talked up in especially the Sunday school manuals is how the Bible being translated to English was a huge deal for leading towards the Restoration, because it meant the common person could understand the Bible for the first time, and they didn't need priests to guide them. So that feels very Mormon to me.
It's interesting in that I'm reading the Old Testament this year and reading some commentaries on it, but that, like, this pattern has happened multiple times, right? At the time that Christ was on the earth, the Hebrew Bible was written in Hebrew, but most people didn't speak Hebrew. They were speaking Greek. And so we had this same dynamic that we have later in Europe with Latin, that, like, the priests are reading the scriptures in Hebrew and explaining it to the people who are not educated. And then eventually they get translated into Greek and everybody can read it, which is such an interesting dynamic that, like, this kind of goes in cycles just because of the nature of language, that, like, language gets old and then, like, you accumulate power to the educated class and then somebody breaks that. It's an interesting cycle, I noticed.
I think it almost, like, weirdly happened within the last, like, 50 years in English, especially in the LDS Church. This idea of it's the King James Version or bust, which is a whole thing. But literally within the last, I think, month, the LDS Church has approved alternative English translations at different reading levels and encouraged accessing them and reading from them, but still prefers the KJV. But there is this idea of, like, well, it's not something I can understand. And so people often turn to, like, other elements of the church or outside sources, things published by Deseret Book. The church's publishing arm adjacent. It's complicated. Instead of trying to interpret the scriptures for themselves because they can't understand it. And so I wonder if the reason the LDS Church decided to say, okay, new translations are open, approved for use, is to try to combat the idea of only certain people can interpret it.
I'm going to take us in a different direction for the Mormon moment, if that's okay. I think one thing that I was thinking about when we got to the part of the hierarchy is just how much it glosses history. And it made me think about my time on a mission whenever we would teach about the Restoration, right? We would cover 6,000 years, right, of history, where we're just like, it went up to a restoration and went down to an apostasy, and then a restoration and an apostasy again. And we just quickly map that onto the Old Testament, usually to help someone just, like, catch up real quick. I was in Texas, so people were very biblically literate. And so, like, that was really easy to teach, but it's also such the biggest gloss of history. And here we get the biggest gloss as well. It's like, were there people during the time of the hierarchy who also had knowledge? Yes, there was. Roshar is a giant ass place. Like, people have the knowledge. Uh, um, and it's interesting because the Mormon Church also glosses over history and quickly grabs onto those larger threads, which narratively are important, which are helpful to help most of your congregants understand like the broader swaths of history that you want them to, but it doesn't reflect history itself, right? Just as like whenever we gloss history in elementary school, we're like the medieval ages or the dark period when no one had knowledge. And it's like they had a lot of knowledge during that time period. They knew a lot of things. Whereas like it was just little peasant farmers and their feudal system. And it's like, yes, but also, you know, it's more complicated. Or even in philosophy, the concept of like everyone before Descartes had to think collectively, and then we became this individualistic society right after that, you know, figuring out the duality of the mind and the body. And it's like, yeah, but I'm pretty sure people still thought individually back before Descartes. Like, he wasn't the person who just woke everyone up to, we're no longer a hive mind. Although sometimes I wish we were a hive mind, it would probably help a lot. But it's like, I was just looking at it, it's just like 2 paragraphs, right? Where he's just like, here's the big broad swath, and this is why I'm here, and this is why you're here. And it doesn't go into that more complicated history. And it's unfortunate that we don't go deeper into that history usually. But I think from a sense of like, if you want to keep a group, a collective cohesive, it's fortunate. Right? It allows you to simply connect to each other because you all have a shared history. Now you all understand history the same way. But I think that also then leads people to quickly question whenever they find out, oh no, like they actually developed things during the medieval period. My entire world is now shaken. And like it creates this, it reminds me of the story of the building the foundation on sand versus foundation on rock, and the houses who like fell apart and the on one the rock like stood. It's important to recognize here the more complicatedness of history. And I think for the Warren moment, for me, it reminds me of how we're taught these long arcs that help us cohere with each other as members of the church, as people who are connected to Mormonism. But at the same time, it ruins the complicatedness that comes from actual history, right? The story part, the actual narratives, the actual individual lives.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's reminding me of something that C.S. Lewis said about history, that the characteristic flaws of one period in history are solved by the characteristic virtues of another, but that period's going to have its own flaws, right? And so often we're glossing this story of the past that says, this is why we solved it this way. And that sometimes blinds us to the things that this period of history knew that we are no longer paying attention to. For example, we find out there's, you know, maybe some corruption in the Ardentia in a different direction happening in Kolinar, right? That like now that the Ardents are underneath the rulers, they're just supporting whatever the rulers want to do, right? There's no one to say this is morally wrong. And if there is, that person gets executed. So yeah, it's really interesting that, and so Lewis advises us to always like read some old books in addition to new books. I think he said like for every new book you read 3 old ones, because those periods of history play off of each other, and getting to see through the eyes of another period history that has another gloss of what's happened before them and what were the most important moments helps us get out of our own specific worldview that we've set up. All right, so we're going to move into our sacred reading method. We're doing, again, Florilegia. Let's see. So Florilegia, if you remember, is a practice of gathering different quotes and putting them together and seeing what they form together, gathered from different sources. It means flower gathering. So you're essentially gathering bits that stand out to you and then compiling them into your own sacred text. And last time we did it, I had us bring quotes from outside the text that could help us comment on the text. This time I'm having us, because this is a chapter full of dialogue, I thought it would be interesting for us to find some quotes from within the chapter, like literally quotes, things that people said in lines of dialogue, and read them together and see how they play off of each other. So I asked each of us to bring a line of dialogue that stood out to us in the chapter, and we're going to read all of them and then talk about how they interact with each other. Okay, I'll start and then we'll go around and just read them all. So my quote is from Dalinar. And he says, "Just because I loved your father does not mean that I think you are a failure, nor does it mean that I do not love you in your own right." Elle, what quote have you got for us?
Mine is also from Dalinar. The line, "My lack of capacity doesn't change the kingdom's needs."
Adam.
Mine is from Kadash. It says, "As close as I dare to the truth, bright one, as I cannot be as blunt as you."
I'm seeing an interesting connection between yours and mine and talking about like the things that we have to gloss over in order to maintain relationships and the status quo. Like Kadash can't say fully what he would like to about Dalinar, and Dalinar is trying his best to soften his criticisms of Elhokar, even though he is in fact very worried that he's not a good king. So like this tension that we feel as people of, to maintain relationships, you can't always tell 100% of what you're thinking. This way madness lies. Like there has to be some glossing over and softening of things in order to further the better good of the relationship.
I feel like that kind of relates to what I would assume is like a universal regret of not being able to be entirely yourself with everyone around you, or not being able to be entirely with someone, because we have these limited capacities of physical bodies and being on a plane where we can't gel completely with someone's entirety of their self, to put it in a simple way. But like, I think that is something that we all regret, because like we can't fully understand someone else, just as in this chapter, as we've been talking about, right? Dalinar can't fully understand his sons can't fully understand him, he can't fully understand Elhokar, and Adolin can't fully understand women, which no one can. So no, that's not the best thing to say.
Well, not even women can fully understand women, so.
But anyway, no one can understand fully everyone else, and I think that's something that we all can somewhat regret, right?
I think it's interesting in terms of like the idea of capacity, and Liz, you kind of touched on this in your comments. Like one's capacity either for truth or for love doesn't change what somebody needs. And I think Kadash feels he doesn't have the capacity to like affect the kingdom's needs. Perhaps because like he doesn't feel like he can speak out, that there would be dire consequences if he did. But like that doesn't, his lack of capacity to talk to Dalinar doesn't change the fact that Dalinar needs somebody to, in Kadash's opinion, give him the harsh truth. And he's feeling like maybe Adolin can have the capacity to do that. And I think Dalinar says, I don't have the capacity, but I have to do it anyways. Kadash says, I don't have the capacity, so maybe someone else can. And those are just, I feel like they're different ways of responding to that. That lack of capacity, sometimes the answer is to delegate, and sometimes the answer is to just push through it anyways because you have to, or you change or you adapt to deal with it.
It makes me think a lot about how when we regret things, we do things in response to them. So the Vorin Church regretted how it treated throughout the hierarchy, right? So they changed themselves into something different. But now Kadash regrets not being able to speak truth to power in many ways. And they bound themselves because they were responding to one regret, which now creates like a different regret. So it makes me think about how when we regret something and we try to rectify it, that in and of itself can create more bounds and more strictures that kind of can guide our life, but also stop us from being able to do certain things in our life, like how Kadash can't talk to Dalinar, how Dalinar can't just like overcome Elhokar and become king himself. And so like the response to regret created the prison that they're now in, and they're regretting that, but at the same time, they're happy to be in that prison.
So I'd say overall, these three quotes show us that this chapter is kind of about the constraints of mortality, right? That we can't do everything. Your whole life is accumulating regrets and restrictions and things that you wish you could have done differently. And we have to find some way to somehow still live with that, right? And we have to find ways of coping with that. And all of these characters are finding different ways of dealing with those things. And that's basically what our whole mission is in trying to live a moral life, is figuring out, how do I minimize or deal with these things that I regret?
It's just not fun.
I think it's also the restrictions that like are inherent to structures and systems. Like Adolin's regrets about his girlfriend are less about like he's regretting not having the relationship, and more that like he's regretting the fact that he's supposed to be in this heteronormative relationship with this woman who he is supposed to behave towards in a certain way, and he is just not doing that. And what ends up like getting him out of that system is a woman who doesn't like conform in the same way to like these ideals. Like her first conversation with him, she's asking him relatively inappropriate questions, or like much different kinds of questions than other women have been asking him in the past. And like Kadash is restricted by the system that he is in, or of honestly oppression, where he is owned by the leaders. And Dalinar and Elhokar are also restricted by the fact that they are supposed to be in charge. And so like Dalinar's not a politician, but he has to be a politician because of the system he's in. He can't be a dude who just like works on a farm, which I honestly think he'd be happier if he was just like a stonemason or something. Like I really think he would, but like he can't do that because of the system he's in. But like, what do you do with regret about a system?
I now just want Sanderson to create a farm for Dalinar and Hammond from Mistborn, who is the strong-armed philosopher from Mistborn, and they just need to live a elderly queer life together, and that's like their enjoyment. And I think that's what Sanderson needs to write instead of writing the next Mistborn trilogy. It's just like Dalinar and Hammond on a farm.
Dalinar and Noadon baking bread.
Just comes around to the farm occasionally.
Drops off the sourdough.
Yeah, they gotta have the starter, right? And so Noadon's just like walking around. He's like, I gotta keep walking. You know, I'm not walking that in Way of Kings. I gotta keep walking. And so like he's just the occasional visitor, because I do think Ham and Dalinar would be the more homebodies.
Okay, and it's time to move on to our final segment, which is the wisdom of the heralds, where we talk about something we would like to bring back into our lives after doing this sacred reading.
I have been thinking about doing this for the last like week, and I'm going to find myself an app that forces my phone to just lock at like midnight and just not give myself a way to stay awake, because sometimes you have to use structure to force you to do the things that you regret, because you cannot make choices on your own, and that's okay. I'm going to do that right when I get off, go find something. So that's my wisdom.
The other good thing for that is if you have your phone charge outside of your bedroom and keep it like charging next to the door or something. I know too many rules of these things.
Unfortunately, I do need my alarm, and I don't live in a house by myself.
Just put all the phones together. They all need to sleep together. Have a little like phone party during the night. And then get an actual alarm clock. They had those for years, Al. Don't throw away the hierarchy just because you got something new.
I do actually have just an alarm clock in my house.
See, sorted. All right, I'll do my wisdom of the heralds, which is to never regret anything ever again. I am perfect now. I am lovely. I am never regretting. I am just living my good life and never ever regretting ever again. No, I think what I want to take from this chapter, from this conversation, is to kind of live with the regret a little bit more. I think pulling regret so much out of this chapter made me think about how much a lot of the series itself is about regret and responding to it, and how also responding badly to it. And I think some of the things in the books are because of very quick responses to regret. Specifically, here I'm thinking about Adolin murdering Sadius, for example, or things like that, where it's like a quick reaction, a quick response. Yeah, I want to sit with regret a little bit more and just be able to not respond to it as quickly in order to say, like, yeah, I'm feeling the regret, and have that emotion just like be within me whenever I experience it.
It was really interesting for me to try to distinguish between the different kinds of regret in this chapter. So I think my wisdom of the heralds is to, when I feel that regret for something, try to do a better job distinguishing, is this regret because of a choice I made that I can change? Is this regret because of a lack of capacity that I just need to accept? Is it a regret that is just inherent to human nature and I need to commiserate with people over it, but also like accept that that is life? So doing more thinking and distinguishing between these types of regrets so I can productively react to the ones which are useful and accept the ones that aren't. Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination. The debate is, though, do I do the Elokar voice?
The Elokar voice.
Audiobooks, like, you can... It's such a distinctive whiny voice, and it's hard for me to say Elokar stuff without letting it creep in. And I don't do voices.
I listen at 3.5 speed, so all of their sounds mesh.
Ooh, 3.5 is pretty high. I can only get to 2.
Yeah, like Michael Kramer, Kate Redding, I could probably listen to them at 4.5 and still understand what's happening because of how much I've listened to their audiobooks.